these stories are really powerful, and we need to rewrite these stories because it just doesn't have to be this way. Periods are not supposed to be painful.
All right, Le'Nise Brothers, I am thrilled to welcome you to the Better podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Me too. And, you were so generous enough to send me an advanced copy of your book. And we are going to be talking about that today, how to have a better period. And you are a woman after my own heart, let's say. My book and your book, as I was reading through it, I was like, oh, that's right. Oh, I like that. Yes, we have to make sure that we talk about that. And as we're going through, I thought, before we sort of dive in, maybe it might be for my listeners who may have not have heard of you or your work before, a little bit of your origin story in terms of what got you into this work. I find that all women in sort of the period and menstrual space, we all have a unique sort of experience menstruation. As women, there's usually a catalyst that sort of pushes us into further inquiry and curiosity. And I'd love for you to share with my listeners how you got into working with women to help them have better menstrual cycles.
Yeah, so I love that you call it an origin story because I got into Marvel movies during the pandemic with my son. So we just watched a new one. So I loved that. So my personal origin story started with my very first period. And to kind of set the scene a little bit, my sort of experience seeing my mother having very, very painful periods, very long periods. Like she would have periods that would last a month or longer. And then seeing the pain that she was in. And then on the other end of the scale, seeing my maternal grandmother, what she was going through during her menopause and the hot flashes and just the kind of struggle that she had in terms of her body, just feeling she always described it as feeling out of control. So seeing that was kind of my template for menstrual health and beyond. So when I got my first period, it was very painful. And I thought, okay, well, that's normal. And so I had these periods, they were very heavy, they were very painful. And I was kind of going along, trying to manage them the best that I could. My mom didn't really give me that much of an education. Even though I saw what she was doing, she kind of just gave me some tampons and I just got on with it. But then I started to see what my friends were experiencing, and it was nothing like my own period. And I thought, well, what's going on here? Like, why am I feeling like this? And I finally convinced my mom to take me to the doctor because in my family, there's a real distrust of doctors. I know you're a doctor, but
but understandably so. Understandably so. Yeah.
Yeah. And it took me a while, but I finally convinced her to take me to the doctor. We got there. The doctor said, well, this is what periods are supposed to feel like. Here's a prescription for birth control. Here's a prescription for naproxen, which is, very strong painkillers. Off you go. And so I went off, I was taking these painkillers, as a teenager on these very strong painkillers. It just kind of blows my mind thinking about it now. Fortunately for me, I was very bad at taking the pill. So I just never really got on with it. So I don't have a kind of post-pill story because I just didn't take it properly. But this whole experience planted a seed in my mind that there could be something that I could do to change my menstrual health. And then as I went through my life, I tried different things. I was a vegetarian for a long while, and that just led to a cascade of other issues for me: anxiety, depression. I was a bad vegetarian. And then eventually I decided to retrain, and I retrained as a nutritionist after 15 years working in advertising. And I decided to specialize in menstrual health because of my own experience. And I just knew I could help other people not have to experience the same thing that I did, not have to just accept that they would be on birth control for the rest of their life. So that's my origin story.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that your story is going to resonate with so many women listening to this, because so often what you just described is what happens with mothers and daughters. So the daughter complains about having some aberrant symptoms. She's having heavy bleeding. She's having a lot of cramping, pick your menstrual symptom. We go to an allopathic physician, and the solution is, well, we're not going to necessarily ask the question, why is this happening? We are going to ask the question, what is the best medication to alleviate your symptoms? And I think that there's a time and a place for that. But I think that the inquiry, alongside with giving you some temporary relief with the naproxen, maybe temporarily, maybe we should be looking at, is there any hormonal disruptions? Do we have any liver issue? Do we have what is going on? Mineral deficiencies. You mentioned you were a bad vegetarian. So often in my practice, when I've had women who've been it's more, I would say more vegan, maybe more so than vegetarian, but we see the vast majority of them have some type of mineral deficiency. And we've had Dr. Kelly Brogan's been on the show, and one of the things she was saying was a lot of the depression that she would see in practice was actually a B12 or a B vitamin, and some like B6, B12 vitamin deficiency. So I think that what you're saying is going to resonate with so many women, because that's our story. It's culturally very common to downplay menstrual pain. In fact, it's so common that we're used to seeing advertisements around, like the Midols, and like not, calling out any particular, drug or whatever, but it's like, have a better period, just take this, painkiller, versus what you said, which I thought we should maybe underline, which is, I thought this was normal. And it's not in fact normal, but it is common, right? Yeah. And you can see from your lineage, right? You see grandma, you see mom who had a bad experience with their own menstrual health. So you think, well, that's just normal for me and my family. So I guess my next question is, are periods supposed to be painful? And how can we begin to educate our mothers and our beautiful daughters, right? So when they get to that point of going to the doctor, that they don't misinterpret their experience.
It's so interesting that you asked this question, because we do kind of absorb through the cultural conversation that periods are supposed to be painful. And then when you have someone like me, someone like you saying, well, actually, they're not supposed to be painful, maybe some light cramping, maybe some light twinges, but you're not supposed to be downing painkillers your whole period. That's not normal. But when you have someone saying that, people get upset, because we've been taught that periods are supposed to be a time where we're incapacitated, we're angry, we're moody, we're full of rage, we're bloated, whatever symptom it is, you name it, that's what we're supposed to be experiencing. And then when we flip it on its head and say, well, actually, you can be fine during your period. You might be a little tired, you might be a little bit more inward looking, but it doesn't have to be a chaotic time. People find that really challenging, because it's these stories that we learn, and then we start to repeat these stories, and then repeat them down to our daughters, our cousins, our nieces, even like the male members of a family. It's like, oh, she's on her period.
Yes.
Oh, she's going to be upset. I better, I'm going to be walking on eggshells. And, these stories are really powerful, and we need to rewrite these stories, because it just doesn't have to be this way. Periods are not supposed to be painful.
I love what you just said about the male component to it, because yes, we certainly we get the stories from our girlfriends and uninformed teachers and our peers and maybe our mothers, but you also have that story. Oh, she's on the, insert derogatory term here, right? Like she's on the rag. She's, she's ragging now. She's, she has her period, and or other sort of derogatory, let's say, classifications of what it means to be a menstruating woman. And kind of digging deeper in your book, I really liked the book is called You Can Have a Better Period. You started off with some stats, which I thought we might double click and expand on a little bit, just around this topic of culture and menstruation. And I'll just read some facts from your book here. 97% of women hid their period products. So let's say they were in school and, I do this, like you tuck the little tampon in your back pocket or the pad or whatever, because they thought that was the normal thing to do, that if anybody else maybe knew that they were menstruating, like they were in their bleed week, that would be, super embarrassing. And I remember feeling that way as well. 76% felt embarrassed and 56% felt shame around their menstrual cycle, particularly in their bleed week. I think that those numbers are incredible. And I think it speaks to, why we're sort of scurrying about, making sure that nobody knows that we're on our period, trying to pretend, right? Like nothing's wrong. Oh, you don't have to walk around eggshells around me. Like I'm fine, like I strong like bull, like I like to sort of channel my inner Russian, woman and be like, I can deal with it. Like I don't need to, I don't need to do anything. And I think that there's not an allowance. As you said, maybe you're a little weepier, maybe you're a little more lethargic. We feel some cramping in the uterus. That's absolutely normal and expected. But that doesn't mean that the whole world is, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't be not able to engage in your activities of daily living, like interacting with people, going to work, being able to exercise. And we'll talk about modifying exercises today too. But when you were doing research for this book, what was your first initial thoughts when you were coming across this data?
I want to say that I was surprised, but I wasn't. It just verified all of the thinking that I had been doing. And it actually made me happy that I was able to introduce this new narrative or continue this new narrative that is starting to emerge around menstrual health, because we don't need to feel shame around our periods. And it makes me feel really sad that we get taught that the menstrual blood is dirty or it's disgusting and it's something that we need to hide. We get taught that even our bodies, they're kind of like a bit unwieldy during our period. All of these messages that we get taught, and the survey that you mentioned, I found it so fascinating because it was actual data to back up what I had already been seeing anecdotally. What's really interesting is that there's this new survey that came out recently where 2,000 British women between the ages of 18 to 50, they were surveyed, and 85% of them wanted to know more about their menstrual cycle and about their period. They didn't feel like they were taught enough in school. So there's this shame narrative, but equally what I find really compelling is that there's also this desire to learn more. And you were kind of seeing that if you look on social media and actually on TikTok, which I find fascinating. There's this, if you go into TikTok and you search #period talk, there's just an explosion of content. And I think last week, there was some research done and found that a lot of British teenagers and women in their 20s were getting a lot of their education on menstrual health from TikTok. And, we can have a conversation about the credibility of some of that information. But I think what's really powerful is that we're starting to reverse these narratives, and people are starting to actively seek out information and change their thinking around their menstrual health.
I love that. And in your book, you also talk about how, more, we'll say ancient civilizations, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the Apaches, the Hindus in India, they had all of these beautiful rituals around a menstruating woman. And I think that there's, a tide, if you'll excuse or accept my pun, there's maybe a crimson tide of a return back to honoring and having reverence for what it is that, we as women are able to produce, right?
Yeah.
We're every month, right? I can say this, talk about this in the book, and I'm sure we're going to get into it now too. We create an organ. Like, how freaking crazy and how amazing is that, right? So let's kind of lead in. Your book is so well written. If I haven't said it enough, very, very accessible, which I really like. Sometimes, you said TikTok. So of course we're trying to make things like quick and punchy and catchy. But there's also, I think, a need, once there's that spark of interest, let's say, for there to be a need to go deeper and to really understand the science. And you do a really great job of doing that without being, we'll say, too teachy, like to like, this is the whiteboard and here's the, So why don't you explain to our listeners why we need to be looking at the menstrual cycle? I always call it your hormonal report card. You get a report card at the end or the beginning of the month, about how your stress management, your eating, your sleeping, your exercise, your movement, the sort of a lay of the land, let's say, through the bleed week. Why do we want to be looking at our menstrual cycle as our fifth vital sign?
Well, if you think about your other vital signs, so if you're out of breath all the time, or your heart rate is going all over the place, you're immediately going to be concerned, and you're immediately going to want to investigate that. I think we need to think about our menstrual cycle and our period in the same way. It's a vital sign. It's an indicator of our health status. And lots of things, as you mentioned, affect that. So if you're overly stressed, if there's some sort of nutrient deficiency, if you're exercising too much, even trauma, all of that affects your menstrual health. And so this is where education is really powerful. It's just firstly knowing how important your period is, and not, for example, if it goes missing, that's not something to celebrate. That's something to really dig deeper into. So you have an idea of what's working. We're not talking about being machines and constantly optimizing our body, but we're talking about being more aware of ourselves as cyclical beings. And this period is part of a wider, very beautiful cycle that once we have the education, we can harness and get a lot of power out of. So just knowing more about your period is the first step to being able to just live a better life and feel better about yourself.
I like that. And I think that, I always say that the period is like the popular girl. She gets all the attention, right? We always forget about ovulation. There's that girl, but she's also really important as well. Let's talk a little bit about the bleed week, because I always get a lot of questions about this. And I know that you'll be able to give us some good insight here. So when we think about what's normal versus what's common, and we're talking about the bleed week specifically, so we're shedding the endometrial lining, there's no fertilized egg, and we are either using a menstrual cup, we're using tampons, we're using pads, what have you. What is, and we can kind of go through these in tandem, normal, what should we expect, let's say, at the beginning of our bleed week in terms of flow and color of the blood? And how does that change over the course of your bleed time?
Yeah, so I think we should really be expecting a very even flow. Some women, they experience a very heavy flow in the first 2 days, and then they describe it like a tap turning off. Ideally, we want it to be fairly even and then gradually tailing off, with not a huge amount of spotting. It's just, it's just gradually ending, and then that's finished. You're not looking for, you don't want dark, very, very dark, rusty blood. You're looking for more of a cranberry color. Maybe it's a bit darker. If it's brown, especially in the beginning, a lot of brown spotting, that's something to investigate. But the ideal situation, it's bright, it's maybe a little bit of a darker cranberry. There's no or very few clots. Your clotting is a sign that you need to investigate what's going on with your estrogen, as they say over here, estrogen and progesterone balance. So that's what we're looking for in terms of color and even flow. You're not wanting to change your menstrual product every hour. It should be something that you feel that you can manage, especially overnight, where you're not having to get up and change whatever you're using. You're not kind of leaking. It's all feels really manageable. Maybe not easy, but it feels manageable.
Yes. Yeah. And the color, what I often find is many women will report, as you're saying, that cranberry color, like that dark or deep, rich red. And then towards the end of your period, as it's tailing off, then we start to see more of that oxidized blood. So that kind of rusty brown, that's normal. But what you're referring to when it's kind of brown right from the beginning is that potentially if you're spotting as well, maybe there's some, we'll get to it, but the luteal phase potentially deficiency or not enough progesterone, where we're starting to get some of that spotting before the actual bleed is happening. Talk to us a little bit about, energy during that week. What is normal? And we can maybe contrast that with what is common. Our temperature during that week, and we'll skip the cervical fluid because we'll get into that. We're not going to be evaluating cervical fluid when we're bleeding. We do that in week 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah. So energy is a really interesting one, and I like to use the analogy of thinking about our energy as if you're depositing it or withdrawing it from a bank account. So if you think about your whole menstrual cycle, you want to be judicious about your energy. This is the time where your energy is naturally going to be at its lowest point, but that doesn't mean that you're supposed to be exhausted and struggling to live your normal life. It's a time where you just might feel a little bit muted energy wise. You're kind of dialing it down in terms of your exercise, really listening to your body. Maybe, you can do your typical exercise classes, but you're not having high expectations for yourself. It's really a time where you're tuning in, you're slowing down, and you're giving your body what it needs. Because the more you push yourself, the more depleted you will be. And I see this actually with women who, they love that mid-cycle energy peak, and they push and they push and they push. But then when it comes to the end of their menstrual cycle and then their period, they've got nothing left in the tank, because it's just, they're not kind of they're making lots of withdrawals on their energy bank account. I'm not sure about this analogy. They're not, making enough deposits. So this is the time where we can slow down and really kind of replenish and restore and look inward. You asked about temperature, and I think this is really interesting because I'm seeing a lot of women recently who are getting a lot of period sweats. And I find that fascinating because my mind immediately goes to, okay, what's happening with the thyroid? And the thyroid is it's so misunderstood. And it's so misunderstood in terms of the connection with our reproductive organs, with the ovaries, and this whole, hypothalamus thyroid ovarian axis. And if you're sweating a lot during a period, you want to just say, well, actually, what's going on with my thyroid? Is there an imbalance there? Am I actually eating enough nutrients to support my thyroid health, like the iodine, the iron, the selenium? Like, dig a little bit deeper, work with a practitioner and dig a little bit deeper, because you shouldn't be sweating. Like, I'm talking to women who are soaking their bed sheets during their during
Like
their
akin
period.
to what we might call hot flashes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we talk about another area that's mishandled, it would be thyroid health.
Yeah.
And I think that there's not, again, the connection is often not made. One of the things that I often recommend for women is looking at their ferritin levels. And we don't have to necessarily get into all the weeds with thyroid because it can get very complicated very quickly. But to your point, the main role of the thyroid is to help cells, with the active form T3 to take up substrate to be able to make energy. So if you have a sluggish thyroid, and that might be because your iron levels are low, maybe you're not having enough meat, you're not storing enough iron, like whatever it is, that can absolutely affect your bleed week. And one of the things, my heritage is Portuguese and Lebanese. But on the Lebanese side, on the Middle Eastern side, it was like we have to have blood building foods now. Like now we have to have lamb and we have to have red meat and we have to have broth. Like that's what we were consuming, or at least my grandmother, was making for me during the week where I was bleeding. And I think that that's often lost, right? Because if you think about, we're getting rid of that endometrial lining, like your body has been making this 5-star hotel for a month. And now all of those nutrients, all of those things that have been building up in that lining, you're getting rid of. And part of that, of course, like when you're losing blood, this is why a lot of men we say to our men, you should give blood every 3 months or so to mimic that renewal. Because one of the beautiful things that women have is we renew our blood every month. We don't need to give blood maybe as often. Of course, ethically, you might want to do that. But, in terms of a physiological need, men might need to do that more often than women. But we're losing a lot of that, like kind of back to we're losing a lot of that iron, which also can absolutely directly affect thyroid function, which is going to lead to symptoms that you're talking about, where you're having these women with these hot flashes, that almost appear like menopause, these sort of menopausal types of symptoms.
Yeah. And then you kind of get the panic, especially if they're in their late 30s and 40s. Oh my gosh, is this perimenopause? Do I need to go on HRT? And in the UK at the moment, there's a really big focus in the media on HRT because there is a shortage. And so it's a big part of the kind of national conversation. And you kind of have to talk these women off the ledge and say, it's not necessarily perimenopause, let's just dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on. But I just wanted to touch on what you said about iron, because I think that's really interesting, because again, this thinking about this focus at the moment on moving towards a plant-based approach, I find it really tricky because you meet a lot of women who have become vegetarian or just eating less meat because they've been told it's better for the environment or it's better for their health. And there's almost a kind of like education process that you need to go through, where you need to talk to them about the different forms of iron, what helps the body use iron well, and actually, how important it is to actually eat really high quality red meat, because that's the best absorbable form of iron. And it's interesting how much this kind of anti-meat message has been absorbed. And when you say, well, actually, you can get really great quality local, organic, or free-range red meat.
Support your farmers. Yeah,
exactly. That's better than the avocado that's been shipped from California or wherever.
I've talked about this a lot on the podcast. I've received some, we'll say, not so kind feedback when I talk about it. But I think for the most part, like 95%, of my listeners are on board with what I'm saying. And then there's, some people that you just invariably don't mean to offend, but do. But this whole kind of anti-meat thing, and I'll say this, and, I'd love your perspective on this as well. It seems to sort of originate, and like, I'm not poo-pooing on San Francisco, but I'm going to poo-poo on them a little bit. It's like from California, Encinitas, or like these, like, where it's almost this virtue signaling that comes at like, I don't eat meat, it's good for the, I'm doing good by the planet, except you're in California, let's say, and you're eating an avocado that's been shipped in from Colombia or from Mexico or something. So, the environmental impact of the food that you're consuming, the avocado or whatever, the pollution that the truck has to emit into the atmosphere to bring you your avocado is one thing. The vegan argument also, there's a huge environmental impact on consuming vegan foods. We have, the environmental, all the fish and the rabbits and the bunnies and the voles and the insects and all the things that are decimated from these monocrops of corn and soy. And then there's this, and this is the piece that I would love your thinking on, is the ethical piece of it. I had Rob Wolf on the show, and I reference this conversation often because it's one of my favorite conversations I've had on the show. And one of the things he said was, veganism is kind of a cis white male philosophy for life. And that's why I'm like, California, it's coming from San Francisco, because not all areas of the world have the topography to have these vast swaths of monocrops. And he used the example of, areas in the Middle East, let's say, where it's very, very mountainous. And the only way that some of these women that live there, because of the cultural constructs, they're not able to own land, they're not able to, own their own homes, but they're able to participate in animal husbandry. So that's the only way that these women are able to provide for their families, is through the selling of, the goats or the, whatever it is that they're raising. And so this idea of everyone should be vegan, I think doesn't take into account the vast diversity, first of all, of the planet, because we can't all live off of corn and soy crops. But it's also kind of sexist, and to a point, and to maybe a lesser degree, a bit racist as well, because you can't expect everybody to eat that way. And it also, where we come from, the foods that are traditional to our lineage is also like, you show me Lebanese food and I'll dance, I'll do whatever you want. Like I'm basically yours. Right. So I wonder what your thinking is around this, because I do see this pervasive anti-meat. And the other thing I'll add, and I would love for you to comment on this as well, is it's the meat and the lifting heavy weights. These are sort of looked at as very male things, like man fire, men want fire, this kind of like, men like to eat meat and they like to lift heavy weights. But I also think that those two things are very important for women. We need to be eating meat, the red meat, as you said, absorbable form of iron for the thyroid, for the bleed week, for hormonal regulation, and lifting heavy weights, again, for some of the same reasons, right? Hormonal regulation, being a glucose disposal agent, having, your muscle is basically your metabolic currency. So I've been rambling on, trying to hopefully form a cohesive thought. I would love for you to comment on all of that.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting, and you touched on it, is this idea of bio-individuality. And we're all different. We're not all, we shouldn't all eat in the same way. And then if you think, you add on the kind of the cultural and the geographic element to it, you have some, thinking about some of the hunter-gatherer tribes, where if you go up north and you think about, near the Arctic Circle, they're surviving on like predominantly meat, and that's their kind of cultural way of eating, and they thrive. And it's only when you start to introduce some of the processed foods that you see some of the health issues that are quite common in Canada, in the UK, in the US. But then in parallel, then you have other cultures in different parts of the world where they just naturally eat a more vegetarian diet, and they do really well on that. So I think what's really important is that we remember that there's no one size fits all, and that, yes, there is a lot of power that we get in many different ways from eating really high quality red meat. but some people, they just don't do well on it. And I think we just need to be careful when we say, everyone should eat red meat. Like, I think when, like, 99% of the women I work with, when I ask them to introduce meat, we have a conversation. Is it cultural? Is it environmental? If they're open to it, I start gently pushing the door open, just in a very gentle way. They will feel better. They just will. But then you have other people, they're just don't want to go there. So we look at how we optimize the iron in other ways, the copper, all of those different cofactors that help us feel better. Answering a question about lifting heavy weights, lifting heavy things. There's no argument for me on that. I think muscle building is so important for women. And once you see women adding on muscle, and this isn't about lifting, you don't have to do some like powerlifting or start, doing loads of bench presses. This could just be resistance training where, if you've got a yoga practice, you are doing those kind of vinyasas and things like that, where you're using your body weight, because as you say, muscle is a metabolic tissue. And after, I think the studies that I think it's age 35, we start to lose about 2 to 3% of muscle every year. And then when you throw in the menopause on top of that and thinking about bone health, it's even more important to be maintaining that muscle mass where you just see women who are, in that post-menopausal stage, they just feel so much better when they've got some sort of weightlifting or resistance training practice in their movement schedule. So, I think the conversation around red meat is really powerful, but it has to fit in for you culturally and digestively. That's a whole other conversation,
right?
Where I got told recently, oh, I can't eat red meat because it rots in your stomach. Oh my.
There are many people who think that it takes, I've heard, it stays in your system for 3 to 5 days and it, rots in your, as you're saying, like putrefies in the stomach. It's like, that's not what happens.
No, I mean, if it's putrefying, that's, you need to go to the hospital.
Right.
But, it's just about unpicking all of these misconceptions around not only red meat, but about nutrition in general, because I think people get really dogmatic about their approach. And then once you get into a certain way of eating, well, it's worked for me, therefore it's going to work for everyone else. And it's just not like that. And that's the kind of beauty of the work that we do, where we see so many different people and we're able to kind of recognize the individuality and kind of work with that.
Yeah. And I think to your point, the name of the practitioner doesn't matter, but there was a practitioner on Instagram, maybe a month or two ago now, who was talking about fruit. And he was trying to make the point that it contains fructose and therefore, is very metabolically disadvantageous. It's going to cause, a whole host of things. And there was quite an uproar. I know I saw your comments as well on this particular practice, and it's that type of cherry picking, like that type of for in the spirit of like openness, like I run a ketogenic style program for women, but one of the tenets is that you should not be there forever. You go into the keto, you get a little metabolic flexibility, you learn how to pull energy from your adipose tissue, and then you move out of it because you shouldn't be there forever. And so one of the big questions is, can I have fruit? And it's like, absolutely, you can have fruit and you should have fruit. We had Dr. David Perlmutter on the show and we were talking about, he wrote a book called Drop Acid, and we were talking about the role of fructose and uric acid production. And what's really interesting is that most fruit have other compounds in them that actually reduce the amount of, in this case, uric acid production. Like we were using the example of an apple, and things like yes, apples have fructose. Yes, that's going to, if that's the only thing that you eat in isolation. I mean, we're not talking about nutrient timing and protein and stuff, but let's say you just have an apple. It is going to spike your glucose. And of course, there's going to be an elevation in fructose, but it also has other compounds that help to mitigate that. It's very different from, let's say, having, like a popsicle or something, or, some type of processed food that you can't, pick off a tree or pull out of a bush or something.
Yeah, I think moving away from this really reductionist approach when it comes to nutrition and anything really is really important, and looking at the nuance and looking at the individual, because, as I said earlier, we're all different. What works for one person isn't going to necessarily work for someone else. But it's important not to kind of fall into these traps that I see where we're demonizing certain foods, because it's just not helpful. It creates guilt. It creates fear around food. And there's just so many beautiful foods out there. Why would we want to be fearful of something that can add so many benefits to our health in so many different ways?
Yeah. Let's switch gears for a moment and let's talk about PMS and PMDD. You talk a lot about this on your Instagram handle, which will make sure that we will also, let me just say, your Instagram handle is a hoot. I love the stuff that you put out on your gram. It's so funny. Like the way there was one, I remember, I think I might've even reshared it. It was so funny when you were, pretending to be in your ovulatory phase, and you were like in this big leather coat, this big leather sort of pimping jacket. It was amazing. But let's talk a little bit about the difference between PMS and PMDD, because I think that a lot of, again, there's conflation between the two terms. I think that what's often, what's commonly thought of, PMDD is just a worse form of PMS, which of course is not necessarily the case. Can you delineate between both of those for me and for our listeners? Yeah.
So PMS is really interesting because we get taught, it's another thing that we get taught, that we're supposed to feel a certain way right before a period. And we say, I'm PMSing. And I find that troublesome because we're putting ourselves in this basket with expectations that we're supposed to feel bad, when PMS it's a syndrome, and a syndrome is a collection of symptoms, and there's a whole range of different symptoms. And so what I love is, if you're experiencing certain symptoms, say in the week or so right before your period, you dig a little bit deeper and you say, well, what actually going on for me? Instead of just labeling it PMS, you're saying, well, is this premenstrual anxiety? What are the cravings that I'm experiencing? And how can I recognize that these are a sign from my body that I need something? The kind of common one is chocolate being maybe a need for magnesium, right? Or is it premenstrual depression? Let's dig a little bit deeper. And then we move from PMS to PMDD. So premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which typically happens after ovulation. It's not, as I've seen on Instagram, an extreme form of PMS. It's something completely different. It's something, there's still, as with many women's health conditions, there's still there's a lot of theories around the cause of PMDD. There is discussions about it being a genetic mutation, so a SNP, on the way that these women handle the post-ovulatory rise in progesterone and that smaller second peak of estrogen. And so this leads to issues around mood regulation. So it can be a spectrum where it can be teariness, anger, all the way through to suicidal ideation. And then you add physical symptoms on top of it. So it's this lethargy, it's muscle pain, it's, this just feeling of not being able to fully engage in your life. And this gets lumped in with PMS, and it's completely different. And the issue that I see a lot over here is that doctors are still trying to understand PMDD, and women get told, oh, we'll take an antidepressant for the last 2 weeks of your menstrual cycle, stop when you have your period, and then start taking it again after ovulation. And you and I both know that, antidepressants don't work like that. So to be cycling on and off of a really powerful medication causes further issues, because you think about the effect that these medications have on gut health. And, with PMDD, there's theories about the way that the body uses serotonin as well. So it's a very complex, not very well understood condition. And it often gets just kind of lumped in as this kind of psychiatric issue that needs to be treated with antidepressants, when it's actually a whole body issue that can be managed in a number of different ways. For some women where they are having suicidal ideation, it might be beneficial for them to be on an antidepressant for a short period of time where they're feeling like so they can feel like they're getting a handle on their situation. That's not for me to say because I'm not a doctor, but I have seen this being beneficial in the past, along with a more holistic approach. But for other women, that holistic approach from the beginning is super beneficial. So I think it's really powerful to understand the difference between the two conditions.
Yeah. And do you find that, are there ways that we can ameliorate some of the symptoms, let's say through nutrition? Have you found clinically with your clients that when you're maybe adding in, let's say, more zinc, or making sure that they're getting choline, or making sure that they're, the full complement of B vitamins are being ingested either, in a supplement form, or we're making sure that they're getting the nuts, the seeds, the meats, that kind of thing. Do you find that there is an improvement in symptoms, and is there a, maybe, I know that, keeping this bio-individuality in mind, are there, we'll say, general patterns that you've been able to suss out or been able to tease out, let's say, around nutritional remedies that have been helpful?
Yes, definitely. So looking at the gut has always been a really great starting point, because of the connection with mental health, but also hormone metabolism. So that's always a great place to start. So, looking at not only optimizing the gut flora, but looking at digestion itself. So it's simple, very simple, but are they having a bowel movement? So many women believe that it's normal just to have 1 or 2 bowel movements a week. It's not. It's not.
Let the record show that is not normal. Yeah. Daily bowel movements, at least 1 a day.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So starting with the gut is really powerful. Something I find really, really helpful is looking at vitamin D, because so speaking about the people that I see in the UK, there's a huge issue over here with vitamin D deficiency. And we know the effect that it has on mood status. And so when you're looking at supplementation testing to see what the status is, if there's a deficiency, supplementation, but also when it's sunny. It's been quite sunny over here in London for the last couple of weeks, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I've spent a couple summers in London. I know it's always raining there, but you get
always
used to it.
Raining. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're getting that vitamin D from the sun, really taking advantage of being able to top up your levels and getting that really powerful form, and also benefiting from that, that serotonin production that happens when you're out, even when you're outside. That is really, really powerful, I found, for my clients with PMDD, because it's something that they can do quite easily and they feel quite empowered by it, because PMDD can feel really disempowering because your moods just feel out of control. So those are two things that I found. Some of the things that you've mentioned as well, the zinc, the choline, the B vitamin, B6 is very, very powerful. But those are two other areas that I always like to look at.
And, it's interesting because you'll find people in Florida, like I've had labs from people that live in Florida with deficient vitamin D. So, we all say, oh, London, it's like you bring your umbrella everywhere, but you can have normal vitamin D levels from, someone who's living in London and someone who's living in Florida, where you might expect, well, they're out in the sun all day long. Well, no, we're not out in the sun all day long. We're indoors under artificial light. And we don't necessarily, not everybody has the opportunity to go out every morning, let's say, and get some of that low solar angle sunlight, or even just midday. Some people are in an office all day long.
Yeah.
So in your experience, if someone does have a menstrual cycle, let's say that is, we'll say that there's some derangement, maybe the bleed week, maybe there's some, ovulatory pain, maybe there's luteal phase, PMS, and or maybe even the PMDD. How long would you say does it take for symptoms to start alleviating if they're taking under counsel some of the recommendations that you're giving them with the movement and maybe the sun and the D and the stress management?
I need to manage expectations here. Everyone is different. What I've seen is that changes can be seen within the month. If you're really kind of getting things dialed in, really looking at the full picture of your health. So how are you sleeping? Sleep is so powerful, and a lot of us neglect that. How often are you eating? Are you eating enough? Are you adding in the fiber, the greens? Are you eating enough fats, the protein? Are you moving your body regularly? We've talked about the bowel movement, so important when it comes to hormone and menstrual health, but also that kind of connection with the community is so important. So looking at all of that, and then supplementation as a kind of cherry on top. Although having said that, it can be very powerful intervention in the beginning when you want to get things moving. You can see changes within the month. So, but everyone is different. Some people, they just respond more slowly. They've got a lot more going on when it comes to the need for liver support or gut support. Everyone's different, but you can change your menstrual health. You don't have to live with whatever you're experiencing. You can change. And those changes can definitely be seen within 3 months.
Yeah. And I asked that question. It's kind of an unfair question because the real answer is it depends. As you said, right? You have someone with Hashimoto's, you have a liver conversion, like you're going to be working with them for several months. And so I think that, as you said, most women can start to see improvement, even if it is a small improvement within one cycle. And again, kind of back to that idea that your period is a hormonal report card. It is that fifth vital sign. And when you start giving the input that your body requires and expects of you, it will start to respond in the way that it is designed to, which is to make you feel like a goddess. Like we should all feel, I used to, my own stories, I used to, just feel like it was a curse for being a woman. I had these absolutely horrendous, like, you were talking about, you shouldn't have to wake up overnight. Like I was waking up overnight. I was bringing different pairs of pants to when I had clinic days and I was seeing patients. I always, first 2 days, always had 2 pairs of pants in my bag because I knew that I was going to go through at least 1, maybe 2. I used to have to get up out of the chair. Like if I was sitting like sort of knee to knee with a patient and then we were both getting up, like I had to get up and like turn the chair around, like so the patient wouldn't see if we'd been sitting for a while.
Gosh.
So I've been through the ringer, but I will say that when I did start making some of the changes within a month, I was like, wow, it actually feels like, I feel like this is what it feels like to menstruate like a goddess. Like it feels really good. I feel connected to my body. I was getting more sleep, more sun. more sort of low level activity, like just little, walks and stuff back, I hadn't happened to be on a trip, but I was walking back and forth to breakfast, walking back and forth for lunch, walking after dinner, all these little things added up over the course of a month. And I had a much better period, and I haven't stopped since. And I think that for everyone that's listening, whether you have Hashimoto's, whether you've just always, maybe you've never even connected it, maybe you've just thought, well, mom had it, grandma had it, that's just my lineage. That's just how we menstruate in this family with this gene pool. The answer really does lie in some of the things that you discuss in your book. And so I'm so thankful that you wrote this book and that you've come here today to talk about it. So if people want to learn more about you and learn about your work, tell everybody where they can find you, the name of your book, where they can find it, Instagram handle, all the things.
So you can find me on Instagram. You can find me it's at Eat Love Move. My website is www.eatlovemove.com. My book is called You Can Have a Better Period, and that is available anywhere you buy books. In Canada, it's available in Chapters, which is a thrill for me because I'm Canadian and I grew up in Mississauga, and there was there's a big Chapters that I would go to just near Square One. Shout out to all the Mississaugians that recognize that. And I would go there and I would browse the books and I would think, oh yes, I'm definitely gonna, my book is gonna be on the shelf one day. So it was such a thrill to see that my book was in Chapters. So, but you can get it on Amazon. It's basically online, available anywhere you buy books. And come and chat to me. Come listen to my podcast. It's called Period Story. That's available anywhere you listen to podcasts. DM me. I'd love to just have a chat.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your book, and so happy we were able to make today work. So congratulations on the book, and I'll have all that information in the show notes. There'll be clickable links for her Instagram, her website, and where you can buy the book worldwide. Thank you so much, Lenise. This was great.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed that conversation and you want to learn more about hormones, check out this video right here.
Oxytocin is the opposite. It's the most alkalinizing hormone. So in fact, you can have a night out eating pretty crappy, but you've been partying with your friends, laughing, had great sex, and you wake up and your urine pH is completely alkaline. That's the power of oxytocin.